Welcome to All Things Chiropractic.
Welcome to another episode of All Things Chiropractic. I'm Paul Andrews.
And I'm Dr. Davini.
And today's topic, here today, gone tomorrow. What we're going to talk about today is preparing to sell your practice. We have had a lot of interest through our membership and our doctors about this subject. And most of them are, hey, how do I sell my practice, get the most for it, and be done in 2 weeks and get out of here, right? No. But there's a lot to consider when it comes to selling your practice. Gone are the days of someone walking in and just unfolding a big roll of cash, paying for your practice, as this ever happened. But, and gone are probably the days of chiropractors holding the paper on practice they sell. Never really the best idea
No. Yes.
as far as that goes. But before you consider selling your practice, what are the things you need to know, right? How do you value your practice? What are the things, Mark, that determine what a practice value could be?
And remember here, we're talking today about the long game. We're not talking about how to value your practice. We're talking about how to increase the value of your practice over time, maybe, to the point that when you do decide to sell, you'll get your maximum value for it. So there's many, many factors, and it's more than the scope of this podcast. But to give you some idea, obviously, patient volume, your collections, whether or not you own or you're leasing, overhead. These are all things that make a difference as far as what the value of your practice is, because you have to remember, somebody wants to come in and buy this practice. They're buying all of that. The good, the bad, and the ugly of it all. So, if your staffing is overstaffed and you have the luxury of affording that staff, we always say there's two functions to staff. There's the staff that makes my life easier, and there's the staff that I need. And when somebody's trying to buy the practice, they're more interested in staff that they need. And later on, when they become the big successful doctor, just like you are, they'll be able to afford the staff they have as a luxury.
To generalize, which I hate to do, but I will, many chiropractors are excellent patient care, excellent clinicians, not so excellent on the business side of things, because they went to school, they wanted to help patients, they wanted to be caregivers, and now they're in business for themselves. They have maybe for a long time. And you may not be or have looked a lot at these types of determination factors for the value of your practice. So as Dr. Davini said, the long game or the midterm game would be to look at these things if you haven't. And now's your chance to enhance those statistics to better price your practice when you're ready, or have a transition plan,
I'm always shocked at how many doctors can't answer a simple question: what percentage of overhead is your practice? Or even better still, how much per patient does it cost you? So that if you're only collecting so much and it costs so much, how much profit is there per patient, which we have formulas that help you calculate those things in tools of practice. But it's necessary information, especially when you're going to ask someone to come in and buy your practice who is more than likely already in debt or already in considerable amount of debt with student loans and things like that.
I want to tap into something with you, Mark. And it's about what really determines a practice value. You know why he's laughing in a second here. But what does really determine a practice value?
Well, to tap into it further, it's what we call the transferability potential of a practice. It's not what your practice is worth. It's not how much money you generate per month or how many patients you see per week. None of those things matter unless it can be transferred to the new owner. So, for example, if we use round numbers, I'm seeing 100 patients a week and I sell my practice, and because I have a terrible transferability potential, that practice nosedives the day I leave.
Just another generality here, but would you say that a chiropractor who's very unique as a personality and or as a practice style? Is that a benefit or a hindrance to a TAP?
Yeah, we call them personality practices. So if you're a personality practice, and you know you're a personality practice based on how you're described, or how your patients describe you, I should say. So if a patient is talking to a potential patient, for example, and they go, I want you to see Dr. Davini. What a nice guy. That's a personality practice. If somebody said, I want you to see Dr. Davini because he really knows what he's doing and he's going to help you, that's what you want. Personality practices are not transferable. Where someone who has clinical expertise, and that's what your practice is known for, is transferable. You have to find someone who's clinically competent and can do what you do, which is possible. Or, you might say, I'll find another nice guy, but it takes a long time to develop that reputation. So when we talk about transferability, personality practices are the hardest to transfer because patients are coming because they love you. Not just because of what you do, but they love you and your personality.
Would you say that because there's a lot of diverse treatment approaches, you can go to 100 different chiropractors and you can get 100 different adjustments. Would you say that treatment diversity is easier to overcome than personality?
It is, because eventually we all know chiropractic works. So if I use one technique and the new person uses another technique, we know that there's a transferability there that will work eventually. And a lot of that would depend upon the doctor handing off the practice, or how much transition period is there where you're both working together. The seller and the buyer are working together. And how much does the seller build up the buyer? And how much does the seller make the buyer aware? This guy is fresh out of school. He's got all the latest and the greatest. So those things will make a difference, and it may take a little bit more time, and it may take a little bit more of the practitioner, the seller practitioner, to be with the buyer practitioner, but it's different than a personality practice where maybe I'm just a quiet person. Maybe my personality style isn't the same as yours. And if that's why people come to see me and I'm not that person, then chances are you'll never be that person and they're going to go to some other nice guy.
So one of the things that we experience as we have gone in and done transferability studies for practices is another transferability challenge can be when something is, let's say, less than compliant that's happening in a practice. I'll give you a real easy example. You think you can transfer this to another doctor. They can pay a robust price for your practice. One of the major services that you get reimbursed for is intersegmental traction. And then people like Mark and I come in and we see, well, you've been coding intersegmental traction with the 97012 since the beginning of time. You clearly did not get the memo that you cannot code 97012 for intersegmental traction. For years now, we can't sign off on that as a transferability code, meaning a code that the new doctor or the purchasing doctor would be able to emulate and continue to get reimbursed for, right?
Yeah, exactly. Unless you're willing to do something technically incorrect. So I'll say that instead of the word wrong, but instead of technically incorrect, non-compliant, unless you're willing to be non-compliant, then you won't be able to generate the same income as the person you're buying the practice from. And we see that a lot. You know that. We've done many of these, and you see that there are certain practices within the business itself that may not be transferable.
And of course, the selling doctor's first response is, well, Paul, I get paid, so the carrier hasn't had a problem with my coding.
Well, why is that, Paul? You're a biller.
Yeah.
So a doctor says it must be okay because they keep paying me.
My short answer is simply you get paid prospectively by the carrier. They don't ask you for notes. They just ask you for a claim form, which is the story of that visit without the note being accompanying with it. So the story is false, right? Because you put on that claim form a code that isn't the code you should be using for that service. So yes, they paid for that code because it's a reimbursable code, but the service was actually not rendered.
So I see two scenarios. One of them is I didn't realize that code was dropped with reference to IST.
Well, you should have been a member because you would have known years ago.
Exactly. And like we always say, the government standard is what you know or should have known, right?
Yeah.
So there's that scenario where I just didn't pay attention and I didn't know or I didn't get the memo, like you said. Okay. Or what if I know that the code is incorrect, which now everybody listening to this podcast knows that code is not correct for IST, and I continue to bill it? Is that a different thing?
Well, if you're foolish enough to admit that, that comes down to intent, and that's the 5-letter word that begins with an F that we don't like to use. That is
Fraud.
yeah. So if that is actually the case, please keep it to yourself, because intent is what fraud is all about. And that, depending on who you're billing, that obviously could be a civil penalty, but it also could be criminal.
And you don't want to sell, or let me put it the other way, I don't want to buy a fraudulent practice. So these are the things you might have to look at and say, transferability. There's a lot of factors that come into play, and it could be the difference between a maximum value for your practice and minimum value for a practice. One that I'll use as an example, because it works both ways, is X-ray. So do you or do you not have X-ray in your practice? So that could be a plus if you had X-ray. But if it's analog, it's a minus. Because now the new person has to come in and do one of two things. They have to convert that to digital, because nobody's running processes anymore. And if you are, you shouldn't be. But nobody's running processes anymore because you can't even get parts to fix them.
I can still taste the chemicals in my mouth from running processors.
God, yeah. And just as a retrospective, I practiced the first 3 years hand developing film. So that'll give you an idea of tasting your mouth, right?
He used to have to hitch his horse and buggy up.
That's all. The gerbil was generating the electricity. But the whole idea is that if you had an analog, the person has to either convert it to digital, which can be expensive, or they have to have the X-ray removed, which can also be expensive. That's a detractor. And that's where we're going right now, is talking about things that either they don't add to your practice, but they take away from your practice. So if I had an analog X-ray in my office, that becomes a detractor.
So what's another, sort of major thing to consider when it comes to the purchase or the sale of a practice?
Well, again, when we look at detractors, we want everything to be perfect, of course, when we go to sell a practice. That's what this podcast is all about, is preparing your practice to sell so that it doesn't have as many, if any, detractors. So take a look at things like, okay, what's my EHR? Do I have some hooey-fluey, fly-by-night, cheapo depot kind of EHR?
We won't name names.
We won't name names, but we could.
Yeah.
Cheapo depot kind of EHR that when the new person comes in is going to look at that and go, what? Huh?
Or no EHR at all.
Or no EHR. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, or no EHR. So EHR can be a good thing. It doesn't add to the value of the practice, because certainly some young practitioner coming in to buy your practice would expect it. But if it's an old cheapo depot one, or if you're still on paper, it detracts from your practice.
I want to pause for a second on the practical and talk about the emotional for a second, right? Because I almost can compare some of this. I've never bought or sold a practice. I'm not a chiropractor, but you have. So it's, to me, I compare it similar to like a buying or selling a house, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you're selling a house, you have that emotional attachment, especially if you've been there a long time. And of course, it's worth a lot of money, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But then if you're going to buy a house, let's say you sold your forever home and you're going to downsize and you're going to buy a house, you're looking at all of the things that are wrong with it so you can drive down the price because, of course you want to pay less. And don't you think, you tell me, doctor, like, don't you think that a lot of selling practitioners have that emotional attachment that is tough to overcome when it comes to valuing their practice?
Oh, my God. It's amazing what doctors think their practice is worth. Very, very commonly, we would say that people believe their practice is actually more than it collects, because I'll commonly get the statement, but it has so much potential. It's like, yeah, well, potential doesn't mean anything when it comes to buying or selling a practice. You're buying the commodity. That's like saying, oh, this house could look nice if you put another $100,000 into it. It could look nice,
Right.
but that's not what you're buying. You're buying what you're buying. So the potential doesn't matter. Also, you have to recognize a couple other things. This person coming in is going to most likely have to take a loan.
Mm-hmm.
Most likely will even have to put a deposit down to get that loan, and most likely will have some sort of debt, like student loans, huge debt. So all of that has to factor into their considerations. What am I willing to pay for this practice? I have to pay for this practice. I have to be able to buy it, pay for buying it, pay my student loans. I have to be able to actually eat and maybe have some kind of car to get back and forth to work, all of those things. So I am not going to pay more than what your practice collects. The truth of the matter is that there's 3 different formulas that we use to calculate the transferability of a practice. And as a general rule, we could look at something and say, geez, 70% of 3 years average collection falls within a plus and minus. And everybody looks at you and they go, well, wait a minute now. That's not what I was planning on. I need 140% so that I can retire. And my answer to that is, you probably got another 5 years left to work.
Tap into that potential you've been talking about in your practice.
Right, exactly. So now there is a potential. And as a biller, let me ask you, commonly there are ways to increase the potential of a practice.
That's for sure. You always have to keep in mind, my mantra to doctors is, you treat the patient, let your financial CA or the biller treat the claim. Don't do that in reverse. Otherwise, you tend to get yourself into trouble. But yes, there are ways to see, hey, you're underutilizing your square footage. You could, maybe put in some low-tech rehab and start doing therapeutic exercises. That's a great reimburser. You're, for some reason, only coding 1 to 2 regions because you want to, quote unquote, stay under the radar, but you're actually adjusting 3 to 4. You're missing reimbursement and your compliance is a problem. There are so many different areas that we can look at, not just in the negative, as we talked about with coding incorrectly, but in the positive, where maybe because you've been around a long time, you're just giving away services that you shouldn't be giving away. You should get paid for that.
Exactly. And these young kids coming out of school are pretty sharp, and they are learning things that we didn't learn, and they are valuable, and they are reimbursable, whether it be through insurances or self-pay. And they get the self-pay to a certain degree, but when it comes to these services, there are ways to increase the value of the practice. Now, as a doctor trying to think down the road about selling the practice, maybe you should be the one considering things that could increase. Don't sell the potential, sell the actual value.
That could even be the basics, right, Mark? It could be maybe put that fresh coat of paint on the inside. Maybe instead of duct taped tables, you reupholster those tables and spend the money. Nothing worse than that. Right?
Nothing worse than, other than like bugs in the lights.
Yeah. Yeah, when we do our rock star CA class for our CAs, we talk about sitting where the patients sit, standing where the patients stand, getting on that therapy bench if that's where they are.
Yeah,
so you can
just
5
cents
exactly, because when we all know that the longer you stay in those environments, the less you see that's going on around you in those environments. You don't see the bugs in the lights. You don't see the mold on the trim. Those kind of things. People, especially younger kids coming out, they want to see those modern, refreshed offices. And so you do yourself a favor, just like at home, if you repaint before you sell, if you bake chocolate chip cookies on the open house, you know what I mean? Like, do those stupid little things.
Do those, like Paul was referencing earlier, pretend to be the buyer. Walk through your office as the buyer, not as the seller, and try and make your practice as turnkey as possible, so that if I buy it on Friday, on Monday, I can be the new owner, generating enough income to pay for everything I need to pay for and maybe even put a little food on my table also.
What do you think of this suggestion, right, Mark? Just like real estate, open houses, they'll open it up to the other agent first so they can hear the feedback. What if you opened up your practice to the most critical friends that you know and let them give you the honest answer if you're tough enough emotionally to handle it?
Yeah, you do definitely have to be tough enough emotionally because, like Paul said, you're going to oversee things, that you just, I know I should be painting that, but I just don't want to.
Right.
And the new person's going to come in and say, oh man, I'm going to have to repaint that. So this is why we're saying the long game. You don't have to do it all tomorrow. You can walk through your office, look at things, decide on what it is that needs to be fixed, make a plan. Basically make a plan. And it could be things as simple as minimizing your staff, lowering your overhead, painting the baseboards. Maybe it is time to put in new rugs, whatever. But make believe you're the buyer.
I like that. Because at the end of the day, when you're looking at your practice, if you can divorce yourself a little bit emotionally and just take a look at the practical side and those things that we've talked about and more, to say, instead of me trying to bail out of this practice and get what I can for it, let's make this practice really hum. Because when you go out on a high note, that's the best time. If you're going to sell on a high, buy on the low, that's what it's all about.
A lot of people have all the wrong reasons why they sell. And if you're selling because it's just time to retire, or maybe you want to move on to a different aspect of your life, that's great. But what we're talking about in this podcast is ways so that you're not selling out of desperation, that you're not pushed into it because of some other issues, maybe health or something like that. We're talking about the long game. Be prepared. And if you never end up selling because you practice for the next 100 years, God bless you, that's fine. But you should always have your practice ready to sell.
It's just some practical advice. If you have debt, work on a strategy to pay that off for lots of different reasons. One, you'll net more on the sale. Two, no one wants to go into retirement with debt. And I'm talking about any debt, credit card debt, business debt, mortgage. If you don't have, I don't know if you know Dave Ramsey, but Dave Ramsey, my wife and I have been into for a long time, and his financial advice has helped us tremendously and my businesses tremendously. But he puts out a funny statistic. Do you know that 0% of debt-free homes go into foreclosure?
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Hey, it's true.
That's just the way it is, right? That's just the way it is. And, if you don't want to sell your practice because you have to, please sell your practice because you want to.
Yeah. And it could be a great opportunity for that young up-and-coming doctor out there. And, especially if you offer mentoring, right? I mean,
exactly.
It's very, very rare that you sell a practice and walk out the door the day of the closing. So
it's important to you. And, it is something that you spend a lot of your time, energy, and money building. And I'll close on this one thought or whatever, that it won't be your practice. So there may be this mental release that you have to go through. You're not selling the practice to continue your legacy. You're selling your practice to let someone else develop their own legacy. So recognize that there will be a release factor that has to take place. Hopefully they're buying something that will continue on to help people the way it should be. But as a one closing thought, I might say both buyer and seller beware.
Well, with that, thank you so much for another episode of All Things Chiropractic. I'm Paul Andrews.
And I'm Dr. Mark Davini. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to All Things Chiropractic. We'd love to hear from you. Visit allthingschiropractic.com with comments, episode ideas, or questions. Or connect with us on Facebook and Instagram at All Things Chiropractic Podcast. Be sure to join Dr. Mark Davini and Paul Andrews next time for another episode of All Things Chiropractic.